everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Gradient MSP holding a webinar here with Todd Kane, looking to talk a lot about data and operations and how you can master your operations by mastering your data and just becoming that next gen MSP. So Todd, welcome to the show. Why don't you introduce yourself, tell a little bit about you.
Hey, thanks, Colin. So my name's Todd. I run a MSP consultancy called Evolved Management. And kind of as the name implies, helping people evolve their organization and become a next-gen MSP, I guess, and increasing profit and reducing stress. My history, I've been originally a tech in the IT space and moved into operations side of the house and really fell in love with it. Some people may recognize the places that I've worked at and been, and sort of the big one was working as the VP of operations at Fully Managed, which is the Canadian ISP or MSP that grew IT Glue. So some recognition there, and now I help multiple organizations at a time, just helping them with their management structure and cleaning up their data and having a more organized approach to their operations.
Yeah, that's awesome. For those who don't know, we're both out of Canada here. So Todd's in Vancouver area, I'm in Calgary area, both Western Canadians, but my MSP competed with Fully Managed. They ended up opening offices in Calgary and Edmonton. I had offices in Calgary and Edmonton, but always respected, how Fully Managed operated and the way that they went about business. It's been awesome to watch the growth that's even continued there over the years. But Todd, you're a wealth of knowledge from operating and scaling MSPs and taking that next gen approach to not how has everything been done traditionally, but how can we look at things different? How can we take a different approach? And there's been so much transition and change in every regard of the industry, especially over the last, coming on 2 years with this pandemic. But, with what you're seeing and the MSPs that you're working with, what have you seen that's really changed in the last couple of years in the MSP business, and how should MSPs respond to those changes, or how have some of the most successful ones responded to those changes?
Well, I think the big one that's apparent to everybody is security. So, security has always been an issue. It's something that is critical to any MSP, and traditionally, I think the security focus has been much more on the client side, and data protection, email protection, some level of phishing education, those types of basics. And now a lot of the attention is much more on focusing on protecting the house. So the MSPs are now the target primarily for the threat actors, and a better security posture becomes incredibly important in all MSPs, because this is probably the largest risk that the businesses face outside of just generating enough cash to stay in business. But the ever-present threat of some threat actor kind of getting inside and getting keys to the kingdom and ransoming a client base of 150 clients is a real threat. It's happening, and certainly kind of keeps some people awake at night. And to some degree, there's not a lot that you can do to foolproof yourself against it. It's just making sure that you do the right things and you have enough measures in place to mitigate the risk, but there's no such thing as eliminating the risk either. So that can be troublesome. The other things that definitely seeing is certainly more maturity around the utilization of tools and the stack that people are adopting. And more gradually, this is certainly something that I built my business on focusing with MSPs to support them and sort of moving into the future. The MSP 1.0 model is, potentially time materials and block hours and the traditional approach to IT. And then people have started to move, into MSP 2.0, where they're doing value-based agreements and fixed fee projects, and that's sort of the traditional MSP model as we understand it. But now, increasingly moving into the future where the break fix and just the general help desk support is largely commoditized, and there's no way you can distinguish yourself on we fix things well, right? Like that's just not a compelling discussion that you can have with a client. And we're moving in much more into a space, I think, served primarily by that security angle, but also much more around business consulting and digital transformation efforts. So really, almost in a way, kind of going back to a bit of the consulting roots for a lot of IT organizations. It sort of shifted towards this help desk model primarily, but the consultancy, I think, around business solutions and how you can better leverage technology, I think will become a much more prevalent discussion and a real source of value differentiation that some providers will be able to separate themselves from the crowd with.
Yeah, I think just to dig in on that, it's so true, right? Historically, when you looked at selling IT services and you're a managed service provider, it was, we're going to solve issues faster, we're going to mitigate some issues from happening. And the way that we all really looked, maybe most, maybe not all of us, but almost ignorantly, was that businesses leverage technology because they use computers and they have servers with data on them, and that's how they use technology, and that's how, as an MSP, we make their business better, is because your servers never go down, you have access to your files, and we'll fix your computers really quick when something goes wrong. But when I look at how we had started to evolve our MSP in the later life, it was understanding that data is being created by line of business applications, and that's being ported around and used in different ways. And then the more we dug in, we recognized, well, there's various departmental applications that are being used to run that business, and various human workflows that are being done over and over and over. And I remember we did a kind of a pilot thing with, we brought in a business advisor that worked for us, and just placed him in a couple clients where he sat and watched how certain departments actually did their jobs in our clients for weeks. And then he went back in our office and wrote everything down, drew up the workflows, looked at the tools, everything, and came back. And he's like, we're not about job elimination, but here's how we can heighten the productivity of your whole company with these applications and better integrating them and swapping this out and automating this and that. And that was just this mind-blowing opportunity that came. And I see, everybody's talked about transitioning to be a VCIO and transitioning to this. And I think you're bang on. It's don't worry so much as like having that seat at the executive table to be setting every budget. Show how you can fundamentally transform their business and deliver business outcomes, which results in more revenue, more product, or lower costs in their business, or reducing their risk. And that will be massive. I think you're bang on with that.
And there's so much opportunity there too. Like, I think so much of this has been borne out by the pandemic as well, because one of the first things that I identified, because people at the early part of the pandemic, people were asking, what's going to change? What does this mean to businesses and to MSPs in general? And I said, my point was if you've been running your business and managing your staff properly, it changes very little, because there's sort of this traditional management methodology of visibility equals productivity is the way I describe it. And it's a terrible way to run a business, because just because someone shows up at 7:30 or 8 in the morning and works until 4:30 or 5 and sits at that desk, that does not mean that they're productive at all. Right. And that was how people measured whether or not they felt that there was some level of value coming from the people that worked in their business. And we see this as MSPs as well, because there's this psychology of certain sort of traditional clients where they're like, they just say, well, can we have a guy on site? I would rather just have my IT guy here. Right. And that model doesn't work. There's no leverage that you can avail in being a body shop and having people placed on site. It's expensive, and it's largely unnecessary. And what was sort of borne out in the data is that part of the reason that people working from home works really well is that in an 8-hour day, you can usually expect that people get 4 to 5 hours of productivity, kind of on the top end of things. And then a lot of the extra hours are generally kind of waste and just kind of shuffling stuff around and kind of administrative communication and things like that.
Yeah.
So of course, like you spread that time a little further over multiple hours and give people some freedom to play to do things at home. And they'll generally contribute the same level of effort over a longer period of time. And I think what this means is that you need to be smarter about the data that you leverage in how you view your clients, and especially how you manage your people, because you can't measure inputs, right? Like no one cares how hard you work. It's a matter of what the results that you produce are. And that's where data becomes really, really valuable.
Yeah, so that's a great way to lead into kind of one of the next questions is, you talked about people management and how to influence and what you should be looking at influencing, but you've gone through scaling companies and you've seen transitions even in modern day MSPs and how things are going, but how should the leadership of the company, how does that evolve in the influence you have on the company as you're going through changes in environment, in things like service offerings, changes in size? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how they can leverage data as a way of informing what they do as leaders.
Yeah. So I think fundamentally change is hard, right? Like there are certain people, a very, very small subset, that love to just change things all the time, but it's incredibly disruptive. So I would say there's sort of two types of entrepreneurs. There's like the constant change agents that drive their staff crazy because every week they show up with some grand new idea. And everyone's like, oh my God, like how long is this one going to last, right? And there's a bit of change fatigue. And then there's sort of other organizations where the owners are potentially very change averse, right? And they do a lot of paralysis by analysis and just the constant sort of tweaking and consideration of, should this be in my stack? How much should I charge for this? And they spin themselves in circles for months and months and make very little progress. And of course, there's people that sort of sit in the spectrum in between those, but fundamentally change is difficult because it's incredibly disruptive. And I think what people need to have a better sense of is, what are they trying to affect? So having the end goal in mind is a hell of a lot more helpful when you're trying to make changes. So if you're making changes in a business, the way I kind of describe this with organizations that I'm working with is I say, I'm not necessarily a prescriptive consultant. I don't come in and say, you need to do this, 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 and this, and we're going to follow this 300-page playbook and start from page 1. My approach is much more, where are you in the spectrum of maturity of MSPs? Where would you like to be? And therefore, what's the plan to affect that change in between? And that's really helpful because then at least you have a bit of a roadmap, right? And then you can sort of say, all right, what are the data points that potentially need to change in order for us to do this? If we need to be more profitable, how do we either A, add more revenue, or what's more likely and more practical is how do we not necessarily cut costs, but better contain costs and produce better leverage for our internal spend? And I think that's one of the big ones that people miss is operational efficiency is one of the most important things that separates a successful MSP from an MSP that just sort of gets by, but generally struggles, right? Like service leadership data from Paul Dipple shows that 25% of the MSP industry either breaks even or loses money. And that's a pretty shocking stat, right? But it kind of makes sense, right? And a lot of that is built on the foundation of people not charging enough, not understanding the value that they can create for the clients that they work with. And they don't necessarily know how to contain the costs and produce better leverage for their spend internally. And so much of this is data driven. If you have the data to access this and understand where your costs are, how they align with sort of benchmarks in the industry, and the value that you can produce for the organizations relative to the revenue. And a lot of that is available to organizations, but it's often clouded in a bunch of garbage and noise because, let's face it, most organizations have PSAs and RMMs that are very fancy, expensive tools that do amazing things, but people just use them as a ticketing system and a monitoring and alerting system. And that's kind of it, right?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, right, is these MSPs have all these tools and there's all this data at their fingertips to be able to get some of these data points that you referenced, but how good is the data really that they're looking at? And I know we've seen some real world examples in quantifying the amount of we'll call it fudgy, dirty, foggy data that's sitting in those PSAs and misinforming things. But like we've had a few hundred MSPs come into Gradient's data cleaning thing, the free solution, and we're seeing an average of $260,000 of dirty data that's just lingering in their PSA. And it's these things across all these varying different data types and record types that you start to look at and you're like, did I ever really know my business? Now, we're super excited to be able to offer that, but how have you traditionally looked at the data and like how do you go about with the MSPs you're working with on making sure that before they make a decision on where they actually are at, what they need to do to change to get to where they're going, how do you go about attacking that, making sure that they're actually looking at the right data?
Yeah, so I describe that as the signal to noise ratio. Right. And you're right. Most organizations, if they've never taken a crack at this or been intentional about things, and I think that underlines a lot of this, is being intentional about what you're trying to affect in your business is a great place to start. So the organizations that are not intentional about this end up with a very, very high noise to signal ratio in their business. And the data is there, but it doesn't necessarily tell them much. Or if they try to leverage it, it doesn't say anything in particular. And so I'm a huge fan of, when I bring on a client, I'll tend to audit their tools and just sort of peruse around, see how things are set up, how the contracts are structured, how the board queues or their queues are structured, how their SLAs are managed. All of that data is really, really telling about how they're able to leverage the data. And what's interesting, just a sort of a relevant side note, is one of my favorite tools in the industry is BrightGauge, or any type of business intelligence tools. It tends to be the one that I know the best and can get sort of the best data from at this point, assuming that the data is clean. And this is sort of the funny part of this story, is that a lot of people will have BrightGauge, and I ask them like, oh, great. Okay, how do you use it? And they're like, well, honestly, like, we bought it and it was cool. We set up some TVs on the wall and we had lots of fancy data, but now no one really looks at it. And I'm like, why do you think that is? And they said, well, no one knows what it means, or it's incorrect, right? And that's where like the sort of the sin is huge in the industry of, yes, we have all this data, but I don't trust it because like what it says to me feels untrue, right? And that's often very much the case. So good example of this is one of the first places I'll start in an attempt to represent the data or represent the company in an objective fashion is we start to look at SLAs. And people say, well, SLAs aren't important because I've not promised anything to the client. Wrong. SLAs are important because they give you a sort of an external judgment of how quickly things move through your PSA. So you use it as an internal measure more than an external measure. So I love working with the SLA because then I can say to them, all right, so your average time to completion on a ticket is 24 hours. And they're like, no, that's not true. Like, we close tickets pretty quickly. Okay, let's take a look at some of the data. And what you find is people are mismanaging the queues that things go in. So you have alerts that from 2 months ago that no one has cleaned up sitting in a service queue. You have tickets that are in an open progress status that's no one's touched for 4 days. Like, of course your data is going to be all messed up, right? So segregation of the data is really critical as a place to start. So you're creating sort of pools of relevant information. So from an SLA standpoint, this is service requests, right? I want to understand how quickly I respond and close tickets from users, right? if we have a proactive ticket and someone said, hey, we should do a bit of a cleanup of the network closet in this client, and that sits there for a year and a half, right? Like often you use 400-day-old tickets, like that's probably not relevant anymore, and it's certainly not a service issue, right? So that's a great place to start, is working from an SLA or some type of metric and saying, and just doing diagnosis on, why do you think this doesn't feel correct based on what you understand of the business? And quite often it's related to how the data is managed in the tools.
Well, and building that trust that you have in the data. Like, I think that's the craziest thing that you said to me is, they have this thing and they don't trust it because it's wrong. Well, to do an analogy, like, so many people have blind trust in so many things that they should test or check. You go out in your vehicle every day and you hop on the freeway and you're driving, 60 plus miles an hour. When's the last time you had your brakes re-verified, tested, checked, all of that type of stuff? Probably not often, but you have this blind trust that if you need to slam on the brakes, you're going to stop and be fine. When you're putting that same level of trust in the data that's informing every business decision that you're making today, or trying to understand how things are going, that, oh no, I know that the data is going to be good or not, or they actually know that it's not, which is even the scarier part, as I know it's not good, but I'm still making decisions based off of it, which just baffles me, because you wouldn't do that anywhere else in your life, right? If you're in a relationship and you're seeing red flags fly like crazy with somebody, you're not going to be like, it's totally fine, let's just keep, no, it's like, okay, we're going to deal with this right now. But yeah,
I like that analogy. Where my mind went with that is, it's the equivalent of saying, well, my gas gauge says that the gas tank is full, but every 100 kilometers or so, I go to the gas station and fill up because I don't think it's correct, right?
yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, it's kind of nuts. So when we talk about like the get data under control, they're starting to understand, where they are, and know that you're not prescriptive, but what are some of the next gen type of operating practices that MSP should know about and should be considering as they're looking at how their business is performing, where they want to take it, and what they could do? You mentioned that the biggest difference between the MSPs that do really well and profit and grow their businesses and the ones that lower quartile who aren't even making money or losing money is that operational efficiency. Well, what are these next gen operating practices and things that should be put in place, or that they should be thinking about?
One that I've been very, very passionate about, especially for growing MSPs. There's sort of a fudge law, or a law that I describe as the law of doubling. So every time you double the size of your company, it's like fundamentally restarting, right? It just feels like what got you here won't get you to where you want to go. And that tends to recur every time you double the size of your company. So what people tend to find is, in a very small upstart MSP, I describe this as the 5 smart guys in a room, right? The owner starts a company, brings on a couple of staff to help them out, and things are humming along. And until you get to that sort of 5 people all sitting in the room and they all sort of feel connected, they all generally have their individual accountabilities and they help each other out, that works fairly well. You double the size of the company to about 10, and that system completely degrades from its effectiveness in managing the organization. And this is where I really find the best work that I can do with clients is catching them before they grow beyond this 8 or 10 staff, because they need to understand how they're actually going to grow the business with some intention. Again, right? Like that point of being intentional. And what often happens is they get to kind of that 10, or they grow to that 15 point, and they're pulling their hair out and they're working 80 hours a week, and everything feels like it's on fire. They feel like they're the bottleneck for everything. And they look to their most senior member of the team and say, you've been here a while, you kind of know how things operate. How about you manage the team? I'm sure you'll do great. They slap them on the bum and send them out there. And the equivalent that I suggest in this, again, somewhat coming back to the data, is imagine that you were running a $5 or $6 million business, or a $2 million business for that matter. And you hire a bookkeeper who basically worked in retail, and you're like, hey, you ran a store, and here's my books. I'm sure you'll do fine. I figured it out. You can too. No one would do that, right? Like
Yeah.
I have a $2 million business unit, and I have a bookkeeper who knows nothing about accounting. Yet we're perfectly comfortable with the idea of taking a technician and entrusting them to manage a $2 million business unit of staff, and just say, I figured it out, sort of, which is kind of a lie, and I'm sure you'll do fine. So that management framework becomes incredibly important, because if you get it wrong, it's a whole rat nest to untangle later on.
Yeah.
Right now, promoted someone to management, everyone's unhappy, including them. And how do you walk this back? Right? It's really, really problematic. So the first and foremost is an effective management structure that allows the owner to step back from the operational duties and focus on more strategic activities. And that depends kind of what they want to focus on. Some may want to remain technical and they don't want to be bothered with sort of the administrative overhead of the business. Some may want to work on sales or account management and not be bothered with the technical sides of the business. So that becomes the most important first layer to this, is understanding how you're actually going to grow the organization and be able to influence and manage the staff appropriately so that the business produces the results that you need. Secondarily, now that someone is hopefully responsible for that level of account management and potentially project management, that becomes kind of the next layer to look after, right? I sort of have this description of a service pyramid, right, where the service delivery, the service desk or help desk, is at the bottom of that pyramid, because if you can't get that right, no one else will listen to you about anything else you have to say. So once you move past that, then you can get into account management. And that's where things really start to turn, right? That you've managed service well, you've managed projects well, and now you can get into account management and create a value differentiation in the eyes of the client, right? They understand who you are, what level of value you provide beyond just, hey, something's broken, call the IT guy. You want them to actually proactively think about what would Colin, our technology guy, think about this? Or we feel some level of friction in the business and this doesn't work well. We're not really sure why. Maybe there's a better solution here, right?
Yeah.
And being able to represent yourself in that level of value with an organization, that's where the differentiation is made and where the money is, for sure.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, right? As you're going through things, understanding what's repeatable, what's scalable, and what makes the most sense. I've heard countless stories of organizations that have went and taken your best technician and made them the service manager. And it's like, wow, now our SLAs probably just dropped, our client confidence, we're spending all this time on transition, and did they even want to manage? Or the best salesperson and the sales manager. What's the revenue hit that you just took on a regular basis when, that maybe wasn't the best move, right? So there's all of those things, and being prescriptive about growth and understanding, some of the things that you were saying, right, of what got you here isn't going to get you there. And I remember when we were doing our MSP, it was, the friends and family network of, hey, this is how we're going to grow. And then all of a sudden you tap that out and it's like, okay, this isn't repeatable or scalable anymore. So I need to find a way to meet more people that we can, and then so you would do certain things at your size that made sense. And after a while, it was like, okay, that's great. But if you want to hit a certain percentage growth year over year, that doesn't become scalable, of hitting the streets, knocking on doors, dropping mail pieces. And so then it's like, okay, what kind of media advertising can you get into? What's next? And that just continues going on and kind of goes throughout everything, even down to funding business, right? Whether you start with your own money and then you go to maybe some friends and family, maybe you do some debt financing and then some private equity or institutional investment. And so it is a big thing of having an appreciation for what stage you're at, what's that next wave of growth, or what's that next milestone to hit, and what do you need to get there, looking forward to the next phase of what's going to have to be modified or adapted in the business to accommodate that. So that's amazing advice and feedback.
Just one other piece I would say is like being coming back to sort of what we said earlier, is being objective about your business is also really critical. And like I call this management by exception, right? Like as your business grows, there's no way that you can keep tabs on all the things that are going on, right? Like smaller MSPs, you have a service manager, the owner reviewing every ticket before it closes. That's not practical at scale, right? So you need to understand what are the heuristics or KPIs that indicate things as in green or red status for me, right? And at FM, we were maniacal about dashboards and data representation for all the businesses. In fact, we had TVs that hung on all of the walls and over top of all of the departments. So as I walked the floor, I could glance up and see how each department was doing just by walking past. And it was all real-time data being represented to us. So if I walked down the hall and I looked up and saw a bunch of red numbers over top of someone's department, I'd be like, okay, maybe that requires some level of attention. That's a hell of a lot more practical than just like walking up to people, asking how things are going. 30 minutes later, maybe they give you some information, but they're probably trying to hide it because they don't want to get in trouble, or they don't know that it's a problem, right? All of those things, like having some objective representation of your business gives you a lot more practicality of what and how and when you can focus on that information, rather than just sort of going by gut, which is what entrepreneurs start with and they become a bit attached to. It's sort of what serves them well in the early days, but it doesn't scale. So you need to find, what is the data, what are the KPIs that are important to me, what do they tell me about the business, and who are the people accountable for those KPIs, so that I can follow up with them directly and help them strategize on a plan to correct something, right?
Well, and yeah, I think that's it's interesting, right? And you've talked a lot about data, and I liked your kind of sentiment there, that you're walking around asking people, how's it going, is not going to be scalable, and it's not going to be accurate. If you think about it, people for the most part are going to tell you what they think you want to hear, or they're going to shield you from things that make them feel inadequate or like they haven't delivered. Data doesn't give a shit. Like, it's going to tell you exactly how it is. And at that point, it's all on you as the business owner to have that level of humility that I'm going to listen to it. I'm not going to excuse it. I'm not going to dismiss it or disregard it, or, say why it could be wrong. You need to accept it, take it, and act on it, because that's still going to be the case. If you do no action on it, your numbers are still going to suck. But if you can suck it up, accept it, appreciate it, and then see what you need to do to impact that measure, that's when you'll get going forward.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of a particular data point where that stands out, right? So I one of the data points that I like to have as a countermeasure, right? We want high volume of ticket closures, but we want quality closes. So a countermeasure number is usually a satisfaction score, client satisfaction score, or CSAT. And historically, I've had conversations with owners or the operators and saying, okay, you guys don't have a CSAT number, we should get that in place. And they're like, well, what if the number's bad, right? As if that's a reason not to have a CSAT number.
That's why you want to know it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, isn't that something you would like to know if your clients are unhappy, right?
Yeah.
Like, just that mental resistance to, that feels icky. I don't want someone to tell me that what the service that they're getting is bad. Okay.
Yeah.
But then you can't do anything about it. So you're much better off having that information and it being ugly. At least then you can formulate a plan to make it better, rather than just sticking your head in the sand and saying, no one's told me that there's a problem, right?
Oh, absolutely. And CSAT's one of those interesting ones, because you're only going to get the feedback from the people who really feel strongly one way or another about things, right? It's either I'm really mad or I'm really happy. Everybody in between gets those emails all the time, says, yeah, never mind. But I mean, there's even other data points that you can look at, right? Is what if people are saying that they're really happy and it's really great, but they still keep opening the same ticket, or the ticket reopens? Did you really do a good job solving that problem and eradicating it, or getting to the root? Maybe not, right? And starting to dig in and understand there. I've talked about a whole bunch of things here. Data's been mentioned a lot. talked about some ways to look at scaling the business and being mindful about the approach with that. When it comes to leveraging data in running the MSP forward and doing it, what is the real role that this plays, and what are the best ways that the MSPs can be leveraging all this stuff that's at their fingertips?
Yeah, as I said, I think it's having some of those really, really important KPIs and monitoring them on a weekly and a monthly basis, right? Like first, obviously you need some clean data, and traditionally this has been or required some elbow grease to kind of get in there and tune the PSA and clear out the trash. So, you guys having this tool to be able to do some of that in an automated fashion is a huge value off the top. So assuming you have clean data, then you can understand some of the KPIs that you should be looking for. SLA is one that I like because it tells you sort of the value flow of tickets moving through the system and what you should expect, and whether or not you can accelerate that number. So if your response time is bad, say it takes 2 hours on average to respond to a ticket, okay, let's try and drive that number down. And that becomes a focused effort where you're managing the team and driving them in a direction through processes and systems to be able to drive that number down. Similarly, there's a host of other numbers. You kind of mentioned, are tickets being reopened? Or is there a high volume of tickets, or is there tickets from a particular user? There's a lot of ways to sort of slice this data. And one of the ones that I like in particular is tickets to node ratio, right? So how many managed assets do you have, either counting basically systems with agents like RMM agents on it, versus, or you could use number of users, and then how many tickets are generated in a 30-day period. And what you should be gaming for is around 1 ticket per user or per asset per month. And what I find is most organizations, if they've not really paid attention to this, and again, if they've not been intentional about trying to manage this, they'll often end up in some cases with 4 tickets per user per month. And that's a lot, right? Like it just creates a lot of chop in the service desk. And if you can slice that down to even say 1.5, which is more typical, right? Best in class kind of being 0.5 to 1. But if you can slice that down to 1.5, you've effectively eliminated almost 300% of the volume of your tickets. And that makes it a hell of a lot more manageable with less staff. And what people I think get in trouble with is that they carry around a lot of traditional garbage, and both from a data standpoint and also just from a process standpoint. I'm a big fan of trying to lean out the operation and figuring out what are the things that just don't create any value for anybody. Look, we have this process. We've been doing it for 2 years. I don't know why we do it. And I don't think the clients really care, right? Like maybe we send them this report and they delete it as soon as they see it because they don't know what it means, right? There's a ton of that type of waste. So understanding, where is the value created, and being able to leverage some of the data to be able to cut through the noise and figure out, like, how do we compare against some industry benchmarks, and what does that tell us about where we should be spending time and effort on improving the business, is way better than just sort of, I feel like we should do this, right? And I've seen this sort of a sin of a lot of owners is, again, just managing based on gut. I think this is happening, and then you look at the data, you're like, that's not happening at all, but look at over here, like this is a problem, right?
It's kind of interesting, the where people have affinity to look, or what's more important to them, and then like leveraging the gut a bit too much these days on what should be done or what's happening. And really appreciate all the advice and feedback that you've put in the show here today. I love how you take this approach through to what you should be looking at, get an understanding of where you're at, let's see where you want to go, what do we need to do to get there, and then even understanding not just what metrics or measures you should or could be watching to understand if it's moving in the right direction or how you're doing, but then what should those numbers be, right? Like you said, that ticket per endpoint, let's say, that would be great for a lot of people if they're like, hey, okay, so mine's 2. I have no idea if that's good or bad, right? Like it's those are the bits there. So I think we've dumped a lot of good info here, and we'll work on wrapping it up. But where can people go to find you, to engage with you, understand, how you could help them, or get more information on how they can approach, just improving the operations for their MSP?
Yeah, so easiest URL to find is itisabusiness.com, because we sometimes forget that this is a business. It's not a charity, right? We're not giving away our services here, but itisabusiness.com, or you can search for me on LinkedIn, pretty active there as well. And I have a weekly email that's industry insights and talking about a lot of this, of using data, better management practices, trends in the industry. So that's fairly well trafficked, as well as some training courses. In particular, if you want to train up your service manager, I've got a service manager bootcamp training course, which is well loved by the graduates. I call it the missing manual for the role. As well as a podcast as well that is well trafficked and well liked as well. So you can check out all of those resources, or just hit up the website and reach out to me there. Awesome.
Todd, super appreciate you coming on today. Love the insights, love what you're doing for MSPs out there. And looking forward to getting this information out and helping more MSPs just take that next step to modernize their business and make it a real business, a profitable one that's got predictable growth. So awesome. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Colin. Appreciate it.
All right. Cheers.